Welcome to Unit Design 101, where we break down the overall factors that make units useful in Fire Emblem and beyond. Whether you're a ROM hack creator or merely interested in overall design, this resource is for you. This week we follow up on Armor Knights to discuss Great Knights, the mounted armor knight with a lot of fans and a lot of problems. Now, Great Knights come in two very different forms. The first is simply the promoted class of the Axe Knight in FE4, FE5, and Radiant Dawn. These are not interesting beyond being mounted axe builders, and are not what this video is concerned with. The modern Great Knight was created in Fire Emblem 8, and while it skipped Tellius in the Arcanea remakes, it has been in every game since Awakening. Having both the armor and cavalry tags, Great Knights represent a halfway between the two, the extra movement and flexibility of cavalry combined with the heavy bulk and higher stat caps of armor, though surpassing neither in their specific abilities. The most unique positive trait of the Great Knight is their control over the weapon triangle. Wielding swords, lances, and axes in every iteration outside of Engage means that they have full control over the weapon triangle, a trait shared only by certain versions of generals, paladins, masters of arms, and maybe a few DLC classes. How important controlling the weapon triangle is varies from game to game, but flexibility in being able to equip almost any weapon is quite good. The class also has fairly solid base stats, lacking only in speed and resistance, and even those not as poor as generals most of the time. This is to be expected from a promoted class, but it should be noted that stats are a major selling point for this class. The downsides of Great Knights are their lower movement compared to other cavalry, except for in Engage, and the double weakness to both armor and cavalry effective weapons. Hammers and horse slayers can both pose serious threats to a Great Knight's existence. Small detail, they do not take extra bonus damage from weapons that are effective against both, like rapiers, because weapon effectiveness is a binary flag in Fire Emblem. That would be interesting though. Despite being a fairly well-established class across multiple games, only 4 units in the entire franchise join as Great Knights: Dwessel in FE8, Frederick in Awakening, Gunther in Fates, and Bunei in Engage. This is due in part to being a promoted class, and in part to its status as a mid-grade between General and Paladin. While other units can reclass into Great Knight or promote into one, these are the only 4 units that start in this class. Of these units, Dwessel is a mid-game powerhouse who is very difficult to get killed. Friedrich is Awakening's Jagen and thus one of the few effectively mandatory units for Lunatic. Fates' Gunther depends on your route, but is generally weaker in stats and is used primarily as a stat backpack or pair-up bot, particularly for Corrin with Forceful Partner, and Bunei joins during the Solm arc amid much better units and is generally considered mediocre at best, with few standout traits, making him bland and forgettable even among the generally samey cast of Engage. 4 extremely different units representing this class, making it very difficult to give a single summary of how the class is used by the developers, at least in the player's hands. Enemy Great Knights generally show up as a way to mix up enemy cavalry positions, sporting significantly higher physical defense with notably lower resistance compared to paladins or bow knights, and usually lower speed than either, but otherwise statted fairly similarly. The goal of using Great Knights in enemy formations is to encourage the player to use mages to take them out, particularly in games like Engage, where on harder difficulties the defense difference between them and paladins can be around 20 points. Back on the player side, it's tempting to see Great Knights as extreme generalists, a halfway point between the defense-focused general and the mobility-focused well-rounded paladin with whom they share a promotion branch, with stats very similar to a Wyvern Knight and movement either equal to or slightly better than promoted infantry depending on the game. And that makes them sound like pretty good units. After all, we praised Wyvern Knights for their incredible stats and being very powerful generalists. Great Knights have basically the same stat block, just trading some mobility for some better defense. However, full flying movement is far better than a few points of defense, and generally, the 1 or 2 points of movement that paladins have matter more than the extra points of defense or slightly higher stat caps given to the Great Knight. And when compared to generals, Great Knights feel awkward. More mobility, usually greater weapon diversity, but the drawbacks of cavalry weakness actually start to matter when you put them on a unit whose goal is to sit and tank an entire enemy squad. 3 Houses Great Knights can't use gauntlets while mounted, for instance, a tool Fortress Knights could sometimes employ for damage. Engage gives them the cavalry unit type, meaning they lose the breakproof armor status that made Engage armors so tempting to begin with. One of the more interesting uses for the Great Knight class is as a slight nerf to the traditional Paladin Jagen. 1 or 2 less points of movement, and an armor-effective vulnerability give the player a reason to train other paladins in the long term, and critical enemies to be cautious of in the short term. Like it or hate it, everyone who's played Awakening knows how the Chapter 1 Hammer Risen can completely ruin your day in a situation where Frederick otherwise is the only safe option. If he were a paladin with the same stats, that enemy wouldn't provide any threat to him at all. and making it a poleaxe fighter instead would add extra threat to Sully, who might not be able to survive anyway on Lunatic, but on lower difficulties would still face getting one-shot. Ultimately, that's the luxury that Great Knight's weaknesses provide a designer, not locking yourself into a single effective weapon track to watch out for. I know some people dislike effective weapon enemies being used as a Jagan counter, but ultimately, they're just another tool in the Fire Emblem toolbox, useful for creating texture to an experience, and should at least be considered when crafting a map. So, what's the verdict on Great Knights? Ultimately, they're in an awkward spot. Great Knights lack the high mobility of paladins, or the dedicated defense capabilities of generals. They take some of the downsides of both classes, without capitalizing on either's best upsides. Using the class design side as a targeted nerf for Jagans on mobility and effective damage alone is a viable strategy if you're a designer wanting to create threats that can kill a Jagan but leave other units relatively unhindered. That said, they do still have a very solid stat block, and weapon versatility can help them utilize all of your best weapons while avoiding some bad matchups. A Great Knight can then be considered a good filler unit, capable of meeting any basic role with passable expectations, while never outclassing a dedicated specialist in any of those roles. Some might consider the Great Knight the ultimate generalist in this way. But what are your thoughts on Great Knights? Let me know in the comments down below or on Discord. A big thank you to Laguzguard members C2 Peekily, Enigmatic Mr. L, The Big Herman 007, Bro Duderman, NKO Rico, Kumi, and Miss Mesmerism for supporting the channel directly. And until next time, this is Mithril Zenith signing out.